Hello, everyone. Welcome again to one of our Removing Roadblocks to Getting Published webinars. My name is Allain, and with me today is Amy Julia Becker. Amy Julia is the author of White Picket Fences, Turning Toward Love in a World Divided by Privilege, which, if you have not read it, is just an excellent book. So I really encourage people to read that one anytime I get a chance to talk about it. She's also the author of Small Talk, Learning from My Children About What Matters Most, and A Good and Perfect Gift, Faith, Expectations, and a Little Girl Named Penny, which I'm sure we can talk more about. That was named one of the top books of 2011 by Publishers Weekly. And another book called Penelope Heirs, a memoir. Amy Julia is a graduate of Princeton University and Princeton Theological Seminary. Her essays about faith, family, and disability have appeared in the Washington Post, USA Today, Christianity Today, The Christian Century, and online for the New York Times, ABC News, The Atlantic, Vox, and the Huffington Post. Amy Julia is a member of Inc., a creative collective, which she shares membership with some of my other author partner friends. And she lives with her husband Peter and three children, Penny, William, and Marilee, in Western Connecticut. So Amy Julia has also spoken at some of our Writing for Your Life conferences, and she's a wonderful person for me to partner with. So I appreciate her partnership very greatly. So with that as introduction, Amy Julia, welcome. Very much a pleasure to have you here.
Well, thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
So if I recall correctly, you started as a blogger and built your platform that way, then wrote your first book. Is that accurate? And do you recommend that approach?
Anyone looking from the outside would say that that's accurate, so it's not inaccurate. I worked on a book that Penelope Heirs, which I ended up self-publishing, and we can talk about that at some point if you want to. I worked on that book from about 2003 until 2008. And then in 2008, I finally thought, okay, I've written this book and I'm looking for a way to get it published. And I was advised not to try to get it published just because of the content. It was about my mother-in-law who was diagnosed with cancer, and I found an agent who is still my agent, and she said, cancer death is not really the way to start a career. But by this point, our daughter Penny had been born, and she said, if you want to write about your daughter Penny, I would love to represent you. So I worked on that book, which is A Good and Perfect Gift. And I sent out the proposal to many, 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 many potential publishers. Many editors were interested, and the marketing team said, we have never heard of this person. We can't sell this book. So the book, essentially the proposal came back to me with the, what I took away was, your writing is fine, but no one knows who you are. And so it turned out that I put that proposal on the shelf for a year and became a blogger, because I felt like that was a way to demonstrate that I had an audience. And so over the course of that year, I started blogging for Christianity Today in particular. And about 2 months after I started that, I got a couple of editors who said, I've loved what you're writing, and I'm curious if you have any book ideas. So again, from the outside looking in, I was a blogger who then wrote a book. But as it happened, I'd already written one book and another book proposal before I started blogging. But it was the blogging that really opened the doors as far as publishing is concerned.
Well, I think, you followed a really wise path, regardless of exactly the, strategy that brought you there. But I think so many new writers that I talk to overlook that. And, they maybe try to launch themselves without a platform. And it's virtually impossible. So tell me a little bit about, as you mentioned earlier, your first book was self-published, and then you went to traditional publishing. Can you talk a little bit about those two avenues?
Sure. Well, I agree with you. I definitely was in that category of trying to launch myself without a platform. Like, I didn't even know the word platform. I didn't know what that meant. And I think there's a little bit of a artistic sensibility, which is like, but my art will stand for itself. I do not need a platform. I'm not a salesperson. And over the years, I've realized, well, if you want people who don't know you to read what you are writing, then you need to sell it to them. and you believe you have a really high quality product, like you believe very much in the product you are selling. So there's nothing wrong with that, but you got to think about who are you addressing and how are you going to get there. And so I did not ask those questions at all when I was writing my first book, and only a little bit when I was writing my second. So with Penelope Ayres, I worked on that while I was in seminary and having babies, so I was not in some kind of rush to publish. And I still think I wrote something that was beautiful and high quality and helpful to people, but I had no context. I had no mailing list. I had no blog. I had no way to connect with people. And I also had done very little to see what it was that an audience would want to read, which is something that eventually blogging allowed. You can write a short thing and see what people respond to, which helps you have a sense of, oh, okay, maybe I should write more about that. So with Penelope Ayres, I worked on this book, I wrote it, and I sent it out to a couple of agents. And 3 agents got back to me and essentially all said, I'm interested, I'm thinking about this, I'm not sure. And then finally, my one agent said, I'm not going to publish this, but I'd love to work with you. And at that point, I was like, okay, I just want to move on. I've been working on this thing for so long. And I asked her, would it be okay if I self-published it? Would that hurt my career in any way? And she said, no, not at all. What I don't want is to put it out on the market and either have no one buy it or have it not do particularly well in the marketplace. And so I just went, at that point, this is now over 10 years ago, and there's so many more self-publishing platforms now and ways to do that are different than what I did. But at that point, I just picked self-publishing arm, and I essentially imported a file and picked a cover and a title and made it happen, which I don't regret having done that, but I wouldn't do it again, I guess is what I would say.
So tell us why.
A couple reasons. One is that I have really appreciated working both with an agent and a publisher. And I know that financially speaking, and if you're someone who is in a position where you've got, you're speaking at a lot of conferences or in huge like church settings already, then self-publishing might be the way to go. And especially if those books, you're intending to sell them to an audience that you already have. But in terms of getting from the audience you have to a broader audience, I do think having the distribution of a publisher, not to mention just the community essentially of a publisher. So you've got multiple people who've got their hands and their eyes on whatever you're producing. And that helps a lot in terms of seeing potential problems, in terms of thinking through how are people going to respond to this cover, to this image, to this title, and then obviously the editing process itself I've been really grateful for. So I just really appreciate working with a team of people and then having a distribution arm, so that there's essentially like a vetting process that someone who's reviewing a book knows that, oh yeah, this publisher has already essentially vetted this person and I trust them. So I'm more inclined to look at this book. I don't think a general reader is paying attention to who the publisher is as much as the gatekeepers, so the people who are doing reviews and that kind of thing. So I appreciate working with the team. I appreciate having a bit of a vetting process and some credibility out in the world. And I also am grateful just for the ongoing relationship. Like I had a book, that came out in October, but 2 months into that book, I said, oh gosh, I should have some discussion guides that are more than just questions in the back of the book to go with this book. And so I've been working with my publisher to put that out into the world. So it's like I'm not alone, and I really appreciate that as well.
Those are really excellent points. Thank you.
Sure.
So this webinar series has been that we've been having is called Removing Roadblocks to Getting Published. What were some of the major roadblocks besides platform that you've already discussed? What were some of the major roadblocks that you encountered when you first wanted to have books published, or even since then? And what did you do to overcome them?
Yeah, so yes, platform was and continues to be honestly a roadblock, just in the sense that I am, not some superstar with a name in neon lights in our culture, and which brings me to my second point. I do think the type of writing I'm doing, I'm attempting to do timeless, thoughtful, reflective, spiritual writing, and that can it is not particularly entertaining. I hope it is enriching. I hope it deepens people. I think it is something that when people read it, they're really happy to talk to other people about and to think about. But it's not, glittery and shiny, which is what a lot of the products that we consume, whether that's, kind of the equivalent when it comes to writing. So it can be the topics I'm interested in and the way in which I want to write about them can be roadblocks as well. So for example, with White Picket Fences, which is a book about privilege. So it's about race, it's about class, it's about disability. So on the one hand, these are topics that our culture is really wrestling with. And on the other hand, they are uncomfortable and people are scared to have that conversation. And so I found publishers tended to be I had a whole set of publishers who really felt like I was not progressive enough on these issues, like I wasn't being kind of prophetic and bold enough in what I wanted to say. And then I had another set of publishers who said, we love your writing, and when you'd like to go back to writing about, they didn't use these words, but writing about something safer, we would love to hear from you, but we're not touching this one.
Wow.
And so it was really a sense of you're not conservative enough or liberal enough or whatever polarizing words I could use to describe that. But I think that's where a lot of our culture is, which is why I really wanted to push forward with the book. And thankfully, NAV Press was very interested and we were able to move forward in a great way with that book. But that sense of, there are certain topics which I think a lot of people want to write about, and ultimately people want to read about them, but it takes more work. Takes more work to read about them. And so topics, platform, and just that sense of wanting to write something that's like timeless and reflective, those things can be roadblocks too.
So you mentioned earlier that you get a lot of support, from the people that kind of have surrounded you in your efforts. Mm-hmm. Talk a little bit more, if you could, about the support network that you've built. What elements of that tend to be the most helpful?
Sure. So you mentioned that I'm a part of Inc., a creative collective, which is a group of writers and speakers. There are about 25 of us who are in like an online private Facebook group and also gather as we are able in person. I've experienced a lot of support through that group, which is taken the form of, just being able to throw a question out to the entire group when I'm like, what am I going to do because this cover design is terrible, or, something like that, or in more formal ways. So I've been a participant in like a writing group where 3 of us through something like this, through a Zoom or Skype call, have read each other's work and offered feedback every other week, and did that when I was writing White Picket Fences. That was tremendously helpful. And I'm now similarly a part of a monthly call with some other members of Inc., where we each just say, here's what's going on, here are my questions, like just things that we want some feedback or accountability on from the rest of the group. I've also had more informal support networks. Like I just have a really good friend down in Richmond, Virginia. Her name is Patricia. She has read drafts of every book I've written and commented. She was an English major and an English teacher, so she has a great sensibility and she knows what readers want. But she's not an editor and she's not a writer, so she can just give me a really honest reader's perspective on what I'm doing. So I've been really grateful for her, and there are a couple other people like that, just friends and colleagues who are willing to read drafts of things ahead of time. And then as someone who's writing about some contentious issues, I've also had some people who've said, I will pray for you as you write, or right now, especially as I'm going out and speaking about these things. I have a group of people who I say, hey, here's what I'm speaking about. Will you pray? And they do. And I'm really supported by that as well. So those are some of the things that come to mind in terms of needing support from other people.
I think those are really excellent pieces of advice, Amy Julia. It's like, I know in speaking with a lot of writers, they view it as a pretty solitary, or can be, at least in different phases of it, a pretty solitary existence. So, I think the kinds of mechanisms that you've talked about in terms of, support infrastructure, and, I think, and you and I have talked about this separately, about how technology like Zoom, like the other aspects of the internet, make having a network that's geographically independent so much more possible and viable and effective. than what's ever been the case in the past.
Totally. I mean, because I live in Western Connecticut in a town of 3,000 people where most people would not consider themselves people of faith. And I've had a writing group here in town with a couple of women who do not share my, faith commitments. And that's been really helpful and wonderful. But I am so grateful to be connected through the internet to all these other people. And I do think creating small communities within this massive online community is a tremendous gift that we have access to right now.
So let's switch gears a little bit and talk about the topic of why a person would want to write a book in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
Their goals and how they can drive different approaches to publishing and platform building, things like that.
Yeah, I do think it's really important, and it's taken me so long to acknowledge this and then to lean into it. These are not the questions I really want to ask myself, but I think it's really important to ask, why am I doing what I'm doing? And I think it's tricky because I am not motivated by book sales in terms of the finances. My job is not lucrative, but it is really meaningful to me. And I think that's important from just a starting point. Like, is this something that you are doing as a vocation, as a hobby, as a career, which I mean slightly differently in terms of what that financial need might be as related to writing and potentially speaking. So I think those are like having a business plan essentially related to the writing and speaking, whatever communicating people are doing, seems important to me, and having some clarity about, okay, I need to make X amount in this year. How would that actually happen? It means I need to sell this number of books, or I need to speak at this rate at these number of places, or, those types of things. If finances are not the concern, but it's not a hobby, if it's something where it's like, but I do actually feel really called to communicate this and I want it to get out to a wide array of people, then asking, and this is probably true with the financial need as well, who am I writing for? Like literally, who is my audience? Is it people who are, what demographic, male, female, age group? How do I access those people? So asking some of those questions. And then I do think that having smaller ways to communicate messages that allow some testing. So I mentioned that with blogging, I could write, 500 to 1,000 words on a topic. And if it was so near and dear to my heart and I thought it was the best thing I'd ever written, and then 200 people read it, versus something that I thought, I'm just going to throw this out there and whoa, 5,000 people read it. That gives me some information that I need to pay attention to in terms of what an audience wants and the people who are paying attention to me, what they are responding to. And sometimes those things aligned. The thing I really cared about and what people really seemed to respond to actually were the same, and those are great. It's like, okay, you might have a book idea there, or you might at least have a chapter idea there. So I don't think that only can happen through blogging. I think it can happen through writing other venues. I think it can happen in podcasts or even in speaking opportunities. But I do think having some smaller ways to assess an audience's responsiveness on the topics that you're thinking about writing about, at least for me, that's been really, really helpful. So those are the different things that come to mind.
I think that's so excellent advice to use the different online points of presence to get feedback.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just a marketing or outbound, type of communication vehicle. Authors need to view it as inbound as well.
Right.
So while we're on the topic of social media, what's your strategy for, and when I say social media, I'm meaning it very broadly. I mean online communication, including blogging, including podcasts, including interviews like this, and traditional social media. What's your strategy relative to all of that?
Yeah, I mean, it has changed over the years. I used to be a much more regular blogger. I had a blog with Christianity Today, and when I was writing for them, it was 3 times a week, and it was pretty intense. And that was great as far as platform building, but it was terrible as far as book writing because I didn't have time to do that, and I honestly didn't have like the spiritual attention span. Both I was really relentlessly responding to the news cycle, and I was writing so much in these 800-word increments that it was harder for me to think and write in these longer periods. So I just stopped blogging altogether, essentially lost my platform, and then have been rebuilding over the past 2 years in a more intentional way. I think, honestly, the most important thing for any writer is building an email list, because you have more ability to directly communicate to individuals that way. I wish that 10 years ago I had started doing that. I'd be in a very different place now than I am. So email list, I would say, is top of the list for me as far as trying to just capture a way to continuously communicate with people. And by continuously, I mean I send a newsletter every 4 to 6 weeks. I try to make sure that that content is fresh and is not spammy in any way, but like, hey, if you're truly interested in what I'm thinking about and doing, I'm going to give you some information that will be meaningful to you. And then otherwise, I mean, I am on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. I have a website. I just this fall started blogging again on my website once weekly, in order to have a way to draw people to the website, as well as just to create some content that will be lasting. So that has felt like it's not taking away so much time from other projects that I'm working on. And then with the Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, I actually have hired a writing assistant, and I create the content for that, but she manages just posting it and figuring out, okay, you're doing a webinar with Brian Allain today, so we're going to make sure that that is on the calendar for this day and gets publicized in this way. And she'll tell me, hey, we haven't done this in a while, that kind of thing. So that's really helpful. And I think I would be pretty overwhelmed if I didn't have that. It would be more consuming. But a lot of it for me is the discipline of actually walking away from social media a lot of the time. So again, using it as a point of engagement. I did, like today, I checked my Facebook messages and there were just like 2 people who had read my book and who wanted to talk more. I mean, and that's where, again, it's beautiful as far as, gosh, these are people I would never have communicated with. One was from the Czech Republic and one was from a small town in North Carolina. And so that's where I think social media can be so fun and enriching and engaging, is that it can connect you all over the world to people, but it also can suck away all the time from actually doing that more meaningful, substantial, thoughtful, reflective, and timeless writing, which is what I hope I'm doing a lot of the time, although I get distracted, as all of us do, very easily.
Well, thank you for that in-depth answer. I think that was jam-packed with useful information. I mean, publishers, that I talk to too, really realize the value of an email list. I think the question is, how do you attract people to subscribe?
Right.
I mean, and I think the other things like, your blog, your social media, your other activities will all help drive that.
Right.
So, what's your feeling about working with an agent as opposed to going to publishers directly?
Yeah, I mean, similarly to liking a publisher versus self-publishing, I'm a big fan of having an agent. Certainly, my agent gets 15% of any book deal or royalties, that I receive. She's not an agent for my speaking, so that's just related to the book writing that I'm doing. So I get paid directly for anything other than the book writing, even though I would say her advocacy for me has affected my ability to get paid for some other things. The reason, though, I'm willing for her to get paid 15% is a couple things. One, I think she can negotiate a higher price for a book deal than I can. 2, she is an advocate for me. Like, when things are going badly for whatever reason, whether that's, I've got a couple different book publishers who are interested and I don't know how to evaluate them, and she can give me some advice on that. Or like, oh my gosh, I just got into this really sticky situation with my editor and I don't know how to get out of it. She can help in that scenario as well. So she can be an intermediary and an advocate, as well as, I think, a person who can advise me and understands the whole of the publishing industry better than I do. She also said to me early on that right now, it used to be that you'd kind of go with a publisher, and some people still do this, and with an editor, and you just stick with them for your entire career, and they're kind of guiding, and they're really saying, yeah, it might not be until book 3, 4, 5 that people know who you are, but we're going to get you there, and we're going to invest in you. And she would say that that is rare now in terms of an editor or a publishing house, but that an agent can play that role of guiding you from one book to the next and helping to establish a career path. And I have been with her, for over 10 years, and I'm really grateful for her being able to see me through all of that. So I've had multiple friends who do not have agents who have ended up in positions where they've got a contract and they can't get out of it and they really need to, or they're not getting paid nearly enough for the work that they've done. Or they get into just a really tricky situation over a cover image or a title or some sort of dispute, and they really wish they had somebody who could handle some of that for them.
Excellent advice. Very practical, like you've learned, through all the places and people that you've worked with.
Absolutely.
So let's talk about balancing time for a moment. You obviously have a family, you write, you make appearances.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk, excuse me, a little bit about how you achieve balance amongst all the different pulls on your time?
Well, I'm constantly asking myself that question, which might mean that I don't achieve balance. Although my husband keeps reminding me, he's like, think about when you are actually balancing, say, on like a paddle board. So not like maybe a balance beam, but even a paddle board, right? That's like a fairly wide platform, so to speak. You're constantly moving or you're going to tip over. And so balance is not something that's static. Like it's like you're always figuring it out. And I'm definitely tipping over and finding myself in the water on some days, without a doubt. But that said, I do try to think ahead and think back. So this fall, for example, I had a book launch and I traveled a couple of weeks in a row. I was gone for 4 nights and it was too much. And that was fine for the 3 or 4 weeks that I did that. But it was like, okay, note to self, 4 nights away asks too much of your family and too much of you. Don't do that again. And so in looking ahead to this spring, there are a couple times where I'm going to be away for 3 nights, but I have essentially made a rule of I can be gone for 1 or 2 nights at a time. And back-to-back weeks is really hard for us. So gone 2 nights of 1 week, home for another week, then gone again, we can do that, no problem. So just trying to get a sense of, and often you have to screw up before you understand what that balance is. And I think it's going to be different for different people. But those things have made a difference for us. I still feel like I'm working on, it's a lot of it is time management and a lot of it is coming back to, put my phone on airplane mode for the next 2 hours and actually do some writing. Chunk my time so that email and social media does not take over the entire day, which it easily could and does some days. And be really clear on what the goals and priorities are, because there's more to do than I am able to do in terms of the time I have. And so just make some choices. I literally use a planner, which I do think helps with balance. And I do a weekly review, which is about both my personal life, like am I, having time with God? Am I having time with my children? Am I exercising? Am I sleeping enough? Like those types of questions, as well as what are my more professional or vocational goals and how am I moving towards those? So those are some of the questions I'm asking and some of that like navigating and trying to stay afloat that I'm doing.
So earlier we talked a little bit about your most recent book, White Picket Fences. I can imagine that the reaction to that book has been a little bit different than it was to your previous books. Can you talk a little bit about that? What's that look like?
So White Picket Fences is a book about it's a memoir about privilege. So I'm writing as a married, white, affluent, educated woman who has had experiences. Actually, I grew up in the South, so there's a fair amount of conversation in that book about racial disparities and social divisions in our culture. I also have a child with Down syndrome, so writing similarly about some of the divisions that we see in terms of who's included and who's excluded when it comes to disability. And obviously there are other topics that get included and lumped into that idea of privilege. So this is a more contentious topic, especially right now in American culture, than the other books that I've written. And I expected there to be a fair amount of blowback. What I was saying before in terms of, some publishers thought I wasn't kind of prophetic and like bold enough, and others thought this is way out of our comfort zone. But for the most part, what I have found is that people who are reading this book are actually responding more positively than I expected. And the way that's been different from my previous books is actually they don't want to just read it, but they actually want to talk to other people about it. And then they want to take some action in the world. Like they want to actually make change in their lives and in their communities. Whereas when people have read my other books, maybe they wanted to talk in a book club about it. And maybe they said, oh gosh, I now am going to do this with my kids differently. I'm going to think about this differently, but it was pretty personal and private. Whereas with this book, I feel like people are like, I desperately want to connect with others and I want to do something that is more public in response. So that has been really encouraging, but also surprising to me. And so I've been working ever since the book came out really to figure out how to give people some guidance in how to connect and how to respond without, most of the audience for this book are white people, and without taking on some sort of like white savior complex, like, oh, I've woken up to this problem and now I can fix it, as opposed to what does it mean to actually humbly and lovingly think about these things, connect spiritually and emotionally to the issues at stake, and then to actually work with our hands. I call it the head, the heart, and the hands out in the world. So, so the response has been different than my past books, but also different than I expected. I thought it was going to be more of like a contentious response. It's actually been very positive, but also really wanting more in terms of the ability to connect and then to talk to others in the world.
Well, I think, as you and I've discussed before, your approach of not telling people what to do and what to think, but instead really describing your experience and different aspects of what, different thoughts, different questions that's driven, I think has been so valuable and so wise. And I hope it's gratifying to you that you have been able to impact people the way that you have so positively, not just to, sit back and think, but to actually, as you said, take action or try to figure out how to take action.
I've been really, I've been so grateful for that because, and honestly, I am still a work in progress when it comes to these issues, and I've learned so much, even just from hearing stories of what other people have thought about or done in response to the book, and the questions people are asking, and the fears that people are raising, and it's been so gratifying and encouraging. And I should mention, for anybody who actually is interested in this topic or who's read the book, that tomorrow, Friday, we are coming out with free discussion guides for people who want to do exactly what we're talking about, to not just talk about the book, but actually, okay, so what do I do with this? What questions should I be asking? How can I connect with the spiritual and emotional aspects of this? And how can I connect on a local level to institutions and other people who care about these things and are making a difference? So it's been really gratifying, and I'm encouraged by what that might mean for our culture at large.
Well, I think, we're all works in progress, and if we don't recognize that, that's a problem. But also, please send me a link to those study guides,
I will.
because
Absolutely.
I will, help get the word out about those without a doubt.
Thank you.
So without, divulging any confidentiality or anything, are there any new book projects that you can talk to us about?
Yeah, I have 2 book ideas that I have not done anything more than like doodle about. One is just a kind of straight up spiritual memoir in terms of, I've kind of been thinking of it like evolution of a believer, just that sense of how do you, as someone who is a person of faith, a Christian, but who's also, I've started to understand what it means to be a Christian differently over the course of many years now, and wanting to write about that. So kind of a straight up spiritual memoir. And the other is actually the concept of healing. I've thought a lot about the relationship between mind, body, and spirit, and how healing happens, how it happened when look at the Gospels and Jesus's approach to healing, how different religious traditions have approached healing, how the medical establishment approaches healing, and also what that might tell us not just about us individually in our bodies, but actually as communities. Because I do think there's like healing that needs to happen in families and cultures. So again, I'm not sure what that would mean as far as a book, but those are the two. I mean, both of those ideas have been kind of in the back of my mind, simmering along for a long time now. So I don't know which one will come forward first, but hopefully in about 6 months, I'll have made a decision and start working on something new.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, we'll all be looking forward to that. And please let me know so I can help you launch them.
Absolutely. And thank you for helping with this most recent one as well.
So we've got a question from Jacob. He is a stay-at-home dad who just self-published his first book. Any tips or tricks for balance?
Oh, for balance. I mean, it really is like just putting limits and trying to accept those as a gift and not as a terrible constraint. But so I think, when I was at home with actual kids around, I did, because my kids are all in school now, but when I was at home with actual kids underfoot, I did hire a babysitter for, I don't know, anywhere from 6 to 10 hours a week. So not a tremendous amount of time, but still, and I actually used those hours to work on whether it was the actual writing or in the case of self-publishing on the promotion of that book. So giving yourself some specific hours in which you are able to work and know that you'll be able to work, that was really helpful to me. And again, to the degree that you have the financial ability to do this, outsourcing as much as possible. So if you're able to get someone else to be doing some of the work and paying them for it, that can also be a way to save a lot of time, because I think time is a precious commodity for anyone, but especially as a stay-at-home parent. So those are probably the two things that come to mind first. And then what are the big rocks? I mean, that's my husband and I forever ask each other, like, what are the big rocks? Because you've probably seen this illustration, but if you have a big jug and you fill it with sand and then you try to put some big rocks in, they won't fit. But if you put big rocks in, the sand goes into all the little crevices and it fills it to the top, right? And so what are the big rocks for you in terms of balance? What does that look like in your family? What does that look like personally? Is it that you need to take a walk twice a week, or you need to exercise for an hour once a day? Those are really different big rocks, but some things that are taking care of you, the people who you care about, and then the writing. That helps me to think in those terms.
Prioritize and focus.
Right, pretty much.
Those are the same kind of topics that have come up in the other conversations we've had about this.
Yep.
So yeah, totally agree. Well, Amy Julia, we really appreciate you joining us. Thank you so much for that, and best of luck with the fine work that you've already done and the continuation of that, as well as the exciting new projects that you have for the future. So we appreciate your partnership. We appreciate you spending some time with us today, and everyone else that's been on the webinar, we are so glad that you joined us as well. So thanks again, Amy Julia.
Oh, thank you. It's great to see you all.
All righty. Bye now.
Bye.